The package wagon rolled into Las Lunas, New Mexico territory, 3 months late, and without the carefully wrapped telescope that Margaret Dawson had scraped together every spare penny to purchase. She stood on the dusty Main Street in the late afternoon heat of August 1878, her hands trembling as the freight manager shuffled through his manifest with apologetic eyes, explaining that her order had been lost somewhere between Chicago and the Southwestern Territories, swallowed up by distance and misfortune like so many other dreams out here on the frontier. Margaret pressed her lips together, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. She had saved for 2 years, working extra hours at the general store, mending clothes for the wealthy ranchers' wives, even selling the silver locket her mother had given her before passing. All of it for that telescope, for a chance to see the stars up close, to map the heavens the way she had dreamed since she was a girl reading astronomy journals by candlelight. "I am terribly sorry, Miss Dawson," the freight manager said, mopping his brow with a stained handkerchief. "We will keep searching, but I cannot make any promises. The route is long and treacherous." She nodded stiffly, not trusting herself to speak, and turned away from the freight office. The sun beat down mercilessly on Las Lunas, turning the adobe buildings amber and gold. Dust devils swirled in the distance where the Rio Grande cut through the valley, and beyond that, the mountains rose purple and mysterious against the endless sky. Margaret walked back toward the boarding house where she rented a small room, her boots kicking up little clouds with each step. She passed the cantina where music spilled out into the street, the blacksmith shop where the ring of hammer on anvil provided a steady rhythm, and the church with its whitewashed walls standing sentinel over the town. She climbed the stairs to her room and sat by the window, looking out at the sky beginning to shift toward evening. The stars would come out soon, as they always did, brilliant and unreachable. She had planned to spend tonight calibrating her new telescope, learning its mechanisms, finally seeing Saturn's rings and Jupiter's moons with her own eyes, instead of just reading about them in outdated scientific journals. A knock at her door interrupted her melancholy. "Margaret." "Supper is ready," called Mrs. Chen, her landlady, a kind woman who had come west with her husband during the railroad construction boom. "Thank you. I will be down shortly," Margaret replied, smoothing her skirts and splashing water on her face from the basin. She would not let disappointment rule her. She had faced worse. Her parents' death from fever when she was 16. The long journey west with her uncle who drank himself into an early grave within 6 months of arriving. The struggle to make her own way in a world that expected women to marry quickly and abandon any intellectual pursuits. Downstairs, the dining room held the usual collection of boarders. Mr. Patterson, the banker with his carefully waxed mustache. The Thompson sisters, schoolteachers from Boston who spoke in hushed, scandalized tones about everything west of the Mississippi. And a new face, a man she had not seen before, tall and lean with sun-weathered skin and dark hair that curled slightly at his collar. He wore the typical garb of a working cowhand: worn denim trousers, a faded blue shirt, boots that had seen many miles, and a bandana tied loosely around his neck. "Margaret, this is Dalton Drake," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "He will be staying with us for a spell. Mr. Drake, this is Margaret Dawson. She works at the general store and is our resident scholar." Dalton stood and offered a slight nod, his gray eyes meeting Margaret's briefly before he glanced away with what seemed like shyness rather than rudeness. "Pleased to meet you, Miss Dawson." "Mr. Drake," Margaret replied, taking her usual seat across the table. The meal proceeded with the typical small talk. Mr. Patterson discussed interest rates with great enthusiasm, while the Thompson sisters clucked over the latest gossip from their schoolhouse. Margaret ate mechanically, still feeling the weight of her lost telescope like a stone in her chest. "I hear you have an interest in astronomy, Miss Dawson," Dalton said suddenly, his voice quiet but clear enough to cut through the other conversations. Margaret looked up, surprised. "I do. How did you know?" "Mrs. Chen mentioned it when I arrived. Said you have been waiting on a telescope." The wound was too fresh. Margaret set down her fork carefully. The telescope did not arrive. It was lost in transit. Sympathy flickered across Dalton's face, genuine and unguarded. "I am sorry to hear that. I know what it is like to wait for something and have it slip away." There was something in his tone that suggested he spoke from experience. But before Margaret could inquire further, Mr. Patterson launched into a story about a delayed shipment of currency that had caused him great inconvenience. And the moment passed. After supper, Margaret excused herself and stepped out onto the boarding house's small back porch. The sky had deepened to indigo, and the first stars were appearing, brilliant pinpricks in the vast expanse. She had memorized their patterns over years of observation with her naked eye. There was Vega, bright and blue-white, Altair and Deneb forming the summer triangle, the Milky Way beginning to reveal itself as a ghostly river across the heavens. She heard the door open behind her and turned to find Dalton stepping out, a cup of coffee in each hand. "Mrs. Chen thought you might like some," he said, offering one to her. "Thank you." Margaret accepted the cup, warming her hands on it despite the summer heat. The desert nights could turn cool quickly once the sun set. Dalton stood beside her, looking up at the sky. "My father taught me the constellations when I was a boy," he said. "We would spend nights out on the range just watching the stars wheel overhead. He said it was better than any church, being under all that vastness and beauty." "Your father sounds like a wise man," Margaret said softly. "He was. He passed 5 years back. Pneumonia took him in the winter of 1873. Dalton sipped his coffee. "I have been drifting since then, working cattle drives, taking ranch jobs where I can find them, but I always look up at the stars and remember him." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people sharing a grief and a wonder that needed no words. "I have a telescope," Dalton said suddenly. "Nothing fancy, but it works well enough. I keep it in my gear. If you would like, I could show you some of the sights tomorrow night when the moon rises late." Margaret turned to look at him fully, searching his face for any sign of mockery or ulterior motive. She found only sincerity and a hint of nervous hope. "You would share your telescope with me?" "I would consider it an honor, Miss Dawson. It is clear you have a passion for the stars, and passion should not go unfulfilled if I can help it." A smile, the first genuine one in days, curved Margaret's lips. "I would like that very much, Mr. Drake. Thank you." "Dalton, please." "Mr. Drake was my father." "Then you must call me Margaret." He returned her smile, and something warm unfurled in Margaret's chest, something beyond gratitude. She told herself it was simply relief at getting to use a telescope after all, but the flutter in her pulse when their eyes met suggested otherwise. The next day dragged interminably. Margaret tried to focus on her work at the general store, measuring out flour and sugar, cutting fabric for Mrs. Henderson's new dress, tallying accounts in the ledger. But her mind kept wandering to the evening ahead, to the promise of seeing the heavens magnified, and if she was honest with herself, to the quiet cowboy with the kind eyes who had offered to share something precious with her. Mr. Dalby, the store owner, a portly man with impressive sideburns, noticed her distraction. "You are miles away today, Margaret. Something on your mind?" "Forgive me, sir. I received disappointing news yesterday about a personal matter, but it has been resolved in an unexpected way." "Well, that is good to hear. Though I must say, you have been looking at the clock more in the past hour than you have in the past month combined." His eyes twinkled with good-natured amusement. Margaret felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I apologize. I will focus better." "No harm done. We have been slow today. Why do not you head out a bit early? I can manage the last hour myself." "Are you certain?" "Go on, before I change my mind," he said with a shooing motion. Margaret did not need to be told twice. She untied her apron, grabbed her bonnet, and stepped out into the golden late afternoon light. Las Lunas was bustling with activity. Wagons rolled past loaded with hay and supplies. Cowboys on horseback trotted toward the cantina. Women carried baskets from the market, and children played in the dust, chasing each other with sticks and laughter. She stopped by the boarding house to freshen up, changing into her better dress, a simple but well-made garment of deep blue cotton that brought out her eyes. She brushed her chestnut hair and pinned it up carefully, then immediately felt foolish. This was not a social call or a courtship. This was simply one astronomy enthusiast sharing equipment with another. Nothing more, but she left her hair pinned anyway. Dalton was waiting on the front porch when she came down, his telescope case beside him. It was a wooden box about 3 feet long, handmade and worn smooth with use. He stood when he saw her, and his eyes widened slightly in appreciation before he caught himself. "You look very nice, Margaret," he said simply. "Thank you. Where shall we set up?" "I was thinking we could head out of town a ways away from the lights. There is a good spot I scouted this morning, a little rise about 20 minutes walk north, if you do not mind the walk." "Not at all. I am accustomed to walking." They set out together, Dalton carrying the telescope case easily despite its evident weight. The town fell behind them as they followed a well-worn path through the scrubland. The desert was alive with evening sounds, insects chirping, birds calling, the rustle of small creatures in the brush. The air smelled of sage and dust and the distant promise of water from the Rio Grande. "How long have you been interested in astronomy?" Dalton asked as they walked. "Since I was a child. My father was a schoolteacher, and we had a few books on natural philosophy. I read everything I could find about the stars, the planets, the theories of how the universe works. It fascinated me that we could understand so much just by watching and thinking." "Your father sounds like he was a learned man." "He was. He encouraged my learning, which was unusual. Most men think education is wasted on women." Margaret heard the bitterness creep into her voice and tried to soften it, but he believed that knowledge was for anyone who sought it earnestly. "I agree with him," Dalton said firmly. "I have known plenty of educated fools and plenty of wise folk who could barely read. It is not about the letters after your name but what you do with what you learn." They reached the rise, a gentle swell in the land that gave them a clear view in all directions. To the south, Las Lunas twinkled with lamplight. To the north, east, and west, the desert stretched out in darkening shades of purple and gray, mountains looming on the horizons like sleeping giants. Dalton set down the case and opened it carefully. Inside, nestled in custom-fitted padding, was a brass telescope about 2 feet long, clearly well-maintained despite its age. He assembled the tripod with practiced ease and mounted the telescope, adjusting the angle. "My father bought this in St. Louis in 1865, right after the war ended," Dalton explained as he worked. "Cost him 3 months' wages, but he said it was worth every penny. He taught himself to use it from a book, then taught me. We spent years looking at everything we could find up there." Margaret watched his hands move with confident familiarity, and she felt a pang of envy at the years he had spent with such an instrument, followed by gratitude that he was willing to share it with her. "It is ready," he said, stepping back. "What would you like to see first?" The sky had fully darkened now, and the stars blazed overhead in their thousands. Margaret looked up, overwhelmed by choices. Jupiter, if it is visible. It is, just there in the south. Dalton adjusted the telescope's position and peered through the eyepiece, making fine adjustments. Have a look. Margaret stepped up to the telescope, her heart racing. She bent to look through the eyepiece and caught her breath. There, swimming in the circle of magnified vision, was Jupiter, a distinct disk striped with bands of color, and beside it, 4 tiny points of light arranged in a line. The Galilean moons, she whispered, awed. Io, Europa, Ganymede, and Callisto. I have read about them so many times, but seeing them. Her voice failed her. It is something, is it not? Dalton said softly. The first time I saw them, I understood why Galileo got himself in so much trouble. How could you see that and not believe the old explanations were wrong? Margaret spent several minutes observing Jupiter, noting the position of each moon, trying to identify which was which by their spacing. She could have stayed there all night looking at just that one sight, but there was so much more to see. May I show you something? Dalton asked. She stepped back, and he took her place at the telescope, adjusting the position to point at a different part of the sky. Look now. Margaret bent to the eyepiece again and found herself looking at the moon, still low on the horizon, its craters and mountains rendered in sharp relief by the magnification. It is beautiful, she breathed, like a world of its own. Because it is a world of its own, Dalton said. I sometimes imagine what it would be like to stand on the surface, looking back at Earth. Would we seem like a moon to them? The Earth would appear much larger, I think, nearly 4 times the diameter. Margaret could not tear her eyes away from the lunar landscape. And since Earth reflects more light than the moon does, it would be far brighter. Earth light would illuminate the lunar night. They spent the next 2 hours exploring the sky together. Dalton showed her how to adjust the telescope, how to find objects using the star patterns as a guide. They looked at Saturn and its rings, which made Margaret gasp with delight. They found the Andromeda Galaxy, a faint smudge that Dalton said was actually another island of stars unimaginably far away. They examined nebulae and star clusters, and Margaret pointed out constellations, sharing the stories and mythology behind them. As the night deepened, they found themselves sitting on the ground beside the telescope, looking up at the sky with their naked eyes as they talked. The conversation flowed easily, moving from astronomy to books to their respective journeys west to their dreams for the future. What made you come to Las Lunas? Margaret asked. Dalton was quiet for a moment, considering. I have been working my way south, following the cattle trails. But I am tired of drifting. I want to put down roots somewhere, build something that lasts. I have saved enough money to buy some land, start a small ranch. Las Lunas seems like a good place. Water from the river, decent grazing, not too far from Santa Fe or Albuquerque if you need supplies or want to sell cattle. It sounds like you have thought it through carefully. I have had a lot of time to think, sleeping under the stars on cattle drives. He turned his head to look at her, and in the starlight, his eyes seemed to hold depth she had not noticed before. What about you? What are your dreams? Margaret hesitated. She had learned to keep her ambitions close, not to share them with people who would laugh or dismiss them. But something about this moment, the vastness of the sky above and the genuine interest in Dalton's voice, made her want to trust him. I want to contribute something to the field of astronomy, she said slowly. Women are not supposed to be scientists, but there are a few who have managed it. Maria Mitchell discovered a comet and became the first woman professor of astronomy in America. I thought if I could make careful observations, document them properly, perhaps I could send them to the Naval Observatory or to one of the universities. Maybe they would be useful. Maybe I could add something small to human knowledge. She braced herself for mockery or condescension, but Dalton simply nodded. That is a fine dream. The world needs people who want to understand it better. Why should that be limited to only men? The relief that washed over Margaret was so intense it made her eyes sting. You truly think so? I do. My father always said the smartest person he ever met was a woman named Ruth who ran a trading post in Kansas. She could calculate figures in her head faster than anyone, spoke 4 languages, and could predict the weather better than any almanac. Smart is smart, regardless of what body it is housed in. They talked on into the night, sharing more about themselves. Dalton spoke of his childhood on a small farm in Missouri, his mother who died when he was young, his father who had been both mother and father to him. He described the cattle drives he had been on, the vast distances covered, the camaraderie and danger of life on the trail. Margaret told him about her parents, the joy of learning in their small home, the devastating loss when fever took them both within days of each other. She spoke of her uncle, a broken man who had come west seeking gold and found only disappointment and drink. She described her struggle to survive after his death, the determination not to marry just for security, the loneliness of being an educated woman in a place where education was often seen as unnecessary or even threatening in a female. It must have been hard, Dalton said quietly. Facing all that alone. I am stronger for it, I think, but yes, it has been hard at times. Margaret wrapped her arms around her knees. There are days when I wonder if I am being foolish, holding out for something more when I could have a simple, safe life. What would a simple, safe life look like? Marriage to someone respectable, children, keeping house. It is what women are supposed to want. But you want more. I want that too someday, but I also want to use my mind. I want to look through a telescope and discover something new. I want both, and people act as though wanting both makes me selfish or unnatural. Dalton was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. My father used to say that life was not about choosing between things you loved, but about finding a way to fit them together. He loved ranching, but he also loved the stars. He managed both. I do not see why you could not do the same, have a family and also pursue your studies. Most men would not allow their wives such freedom. Then most men are fools. He said it with such conviction that Margaret turned to look at him. In the starlight, his profile was strong and handsome, and she felt that flutter in her chest again, stronger now. They returned to the boarding house well after midnight, walking in companionable silence. At the door, Dalton hesitated. Would you like to do this again tomorrow night? He asked. There is a meteor shower supposed to be visible in a few days. It should be quite a sight. I would like that very much, Margaret said warmly. Good night then, Margaret. Good night, Dalton. She climbed the stairs to her room feeling lighter than she had in months, maybe years. She lay in bed looking out her window at the stars and replayed the evening in her mind. Not just the wonder of seeing Jupiter and Saturn, but also the deeper wonder of finding someone who understood, who did not belittle her dreams, who saw her as a whole person rather than just a potential wife or a strange woman who read too much. The next few days fell into a pattern. Margaret worked at the general store during the day. Dalton worked at a nearby ranch, helping with the horses and general labor, earning his keep while he scouted for land to purchase. In the evenings, they met and walked out to their spot on the rise, setting up the telescope and exploring the heavens together. But it was not just about astronomy anymore. They talked about everything: politics and philosophy, literature and music, the changing West and what it might become. They laughed together at shared jokes and sat in comfortable silence when words were unnecessary. Margaret found herself watching for him during the day, her heart lifting when she spotted him riding into town or passing by the store's window. Mrs. Chen noticed, of course. "That young man seems quite taken with you," she observed one morning as Margaret helped with breakfast preparations. "We share an interest in astronomy," Margaret replied, trying to sound casual. "Is that what young people are calling it these days?" Mrs. Chen's eyes twinkled. "In my day, we called it courting." "We are not courting, we are friends. Hum. Friends who cannot take their eyes off each other. Friends who smile just hearing the other's name. I was young once too, Margaret. I know what the beginning of love looks like." Margaret busied herself with slicing bread, her cheeks warm. "It is too soon to speak of love. Perhaps, but the seed is planted, yes. Whether it grows depends on the care you give it." Mrs. Chen patted her shoulder. "He is a good man, I can tell. And he looks at you like you are the most precious thing he has ever seen." Margaret thought about those words all day. Did Dalton see her that way? And more importantly, how did she see him? She had been so focused on guarding her independence, on not falling into the trap of needing a man, that she had not let herself consider the possibility of wanting one, not out of necessity, but out of genuine feeling. That evening, when Dalton arrived at the boarding house, he seemed different, nervous in a way she had not seen before. He held a small bundle wrapped in brown paper. "I brought you something," he said, offering it to her. Margaret unwrapped the paper carefully and found 2 books, both well worn but in good condition. A New Astronomy by Simon Newcomb and The Stars and the Earth by William Proctor. She looked up at him in amazement. "These are expensive. Where did you find them?" "I rode to Santa Fe yesterday on my day off. There is a bookshop there, and the owner had these. I thought you might like them, seeing as your telescope did not arrive. At least you would have current information to read." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. The gesture was so thoughtful, so perfectly suited to her interests. "Thank you, Dalton. This is incredibly kind. You deserve them. Anyone with your passion for learning should have access to the best information available." She set the books aside carefully and met his eyes. "You are a remarkable man, I hope you know that." Something shifted in his expression, a vulnerability appearing. "Margaret, I need to tell you something. These past weeks, getting to know you, sharing the stars with you, it has meant more to me than I can properly express. You are the most fascinating person I have ever met. Your mind, your passion, your strength in the face of everything life has thrown at you. I find myself thinking about you constantly, looking forward to seeing you, wanting to share everything with you." Margaret's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he could hear it. "Dalton, I know it has not been long. I know you have your dreams and your independence, and I respect that, but I have to be honest with you. I am falling in love with you. I think I have been since that first night when you looked through the telescope, and your whole face lit up with wonder." She could barely breathe. No one had ever spoken to her like this, with such openness and sincerity. "I do not know what to say. You do not have to say anything right now. I just needed you to know. I want to court you properly if you will allow it. I want to support your dreams while building something together. I want to spend my life looking at the stars with you." Margaret felt the last of her walls crumble. She had been so afraid of losing herself in someone else, of becoming just a wife instead of a full person. But Dalton was not asking her to diminish herself. He was asking to grow alongside her. "I am falling in love with you too," she whispered. "It terrifies me, but it is true. When I am with you, I feel seen in a way I never have before. You understand me. May I kiss you?" he asked softly. In answer, she stepped closer. He cupped her face gently, his calloused hands tender against her skin, and kissed her. It was sweet and careful and full of promise. Margaret felt something settle into place inside her, a rightness she had not known she was seeking. They drew apart slowly, and Dalton rested his forehead against hers. "We will figure this out together," he said. Your dreams and mine, they do not have to be separate things. Together, Margaret agreed, and the word felt like a beginning. The meteor shower arrived 3 nights later, and they went out to their spot on the rise with blankets and a basket of food Mrs. Chen had insisted on packing. They lay side by side on the blankets, shoulders touching, and watched the sky light up with streaks of fire as debris from a comet's tail burned up in Earth's atmosphere. "Make a wish," Dalton said as a particularly bright meteor flared across the heavens. "That is superstition, not science," Margaret replied, but she was smiling. "Humor me." She closed her eyes and wished for a future where she could be both scholar and wife, where she could map the stars and raise children, where love and learning coexisted in harmony. When she opened her eyes, Dalton was watching her. "What did you wish for?" he asked. "I cannot tell you, or it will not come true. More superstition. Perhaps I am learning to believe in more than just science." She turned onto her side to face him. "What did you wish for?" "You, us. A home where your telescope sits beside mine, where we can teach our children about the cosmos, where you can make your observations and I can build my ranch, and at the end of each day, we come together under the stars." "That is a good wish," Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion. "A very good wish." He kissed her again, longer this time, and the meteors continued their ancient dance overhead. Indifferent and beautiful, over the following weeks, Dalton and Margaret navigated the path from friends to courting couple. It was not always smooth. Margaret struggled with her fear of losing her independence, of becoming subsumed by marriage. Dalton worried that he could not provide enough, that his education was not sufficient to match hers, that she would eventually find him simple. They talked through each fear as it arose, learning to be honest even when it was uncomfortable. Dalton assured her that he wanted a partner, not a subordinate, that her continued education and astronomical work would be something they would both support. Margaret told him that education came in many forms, that his practical knowledge of the land and animals and weather was just as valuable as her book learning, that she found his straightforward honesty refreshing after a lifetime of people who said one thing but meant another. They were sitting by the Rio Grande one Sunday afternoon, watching the brown water flow past, when Dalton brought up the future more concretely. "I found a piece of land," he said, "about 5 miles west of town. It has good grazing, a spring that runs year-round, and a spot on a small hill that would be perfect for building a house and for setting up telescopes." Margaret looked at him, understanding the weight of what he was saying. "Tell me about it." "It is 200 acres. The current owner is moving back east to care for his aging mother, so he is selling at a fair price. I have enough saved to buy the land and build a modest house. It would be hard work at first, building up a herd, establishing the ranch, but I think it could be good, a good life." "It sounds wonderful, Dalton." He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. "I am asking you to marry me, Margaret, not right this moment, but soon. I am asking you to build this life with me. I promise you will have your books and your observations. We will build a study for you with good windows and shelves for all the books we can acquire. We will continue to explore the stars together, and when you are ready, we will have children and teach them to look up with wonder." Margaret felt tears slip down her cheeks. "Yes," she said. "Yes, I will marry you." Dalton let out a breath he seemed to have been holding and pulled her into his arms. They sat together by the river, holding each other, as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson. They married 6 weeks later in the small church in Las Lunas. Mrs. Chen helped Margaret sew a dress of cream-colored silk that had come on the freight wagon. Mr. Dalby gave her away, having become something of a father figure to her over the years. The Thompson sisters played the organ, and half the town showed up, curious about the unusual couple, the educated woman and the cowboy who read astronomy books. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. When the minister asked if Dalton would take Margaret as his wife, to have and to hold from that day forward, Dalton looked into her eyes and said, "I will, for as long as the stars shine above us." And when Margaret made her vows, she added, "I promise to love you and walk beside you, to share my dreams and support yours all the days of our lives." They held a reception at the boarding house, with food and music and dancing. Margaret, who usually shied away from such attention, found herself enjoying the celebration, warmed by the genuine good wishes of friends and neighbors. Even Mr. Patterson, usually so stiff and formal, wished them well with something approaching real emotion. As the sun set, Dalton and Margaret slipped away from the party. They rode in a borrowed wagon to their new land, to the house Dalton had been working on with the help of friends. It was small but well built, with solid adobe walls and a roof of timber and earth that would keep them cool in summer and warm in winter. Inside, Dalton had built a table and chairs, a bed frame, shelves for books and equipment. And in the room he designated as Margaret's study, 2 tripods stood side by side, ready for their telescopes. "Welcome home, Mrs. Drake," Dalton said, lifting her down from the wagon. "Home," Margaret repeated, tasting the word. It felt right. She was still herself, still Margaret with her dreams and her books and her determination to contribute something to science. But now she was also part of something larger, a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine love. That night, they made love for the first time with a tenderness and care that left them both shaken. Afterward, they lay in each other's arms, talking quietly about everything and nothing, occasionally laughing, sometimes falling into comfortable silence. "Are you happy?" Dalton asked. "More than I thought possible," Margaret replied honestly. "I spent so long thinking I had to choose between love and learning, I never imagined I could have both. We will make sure you do. This is our life together, not my life that you fit into." She kissed him softly. "I love you." "I love you too." The first year of their marriage was hard work, but deeply satisfying. Dalton worked long hours building up the ranch, starting with a small herd of cattle purchased from a rancher retiring near Socorro. He proved to have a gift with animals, a patience and intuition that made them trust him. The herd grew healthier under his care, and by spring, there were several calves, the beginning of their future prosperity. Margaret continued to work at the general store 2 days a week, both for the income and because she enjoyed the connection to town. The rest of her time was divided between managing the household and her astronomical observations. She kept careful records in a ledger, noting the positions of planets, the appearance of interesting phenomena, the phases of the moon. She wrote detailed letters to the Naval Observatory, and to her surprise and delight, she received a reply from one of the astronomers there, encouraging her to continue her observations and promising that her data could indeed be useful. They fell into rhythms together. Mornings often began before dawn, Margaret helping with the animals before Dalton rode out to check on the herd. Evenings were for each other, sometimes spent in quiet companionship as they read or worked on projects, sometimes spent at their telescopes on the hill behind the house, still exploring the universe together. They had disagreements, of course. Margaret's independence sometimes chafed against the realities of being a rancher's wife, and there were expectations from the community that she should attend more church socials and ladies' aid meetings. Dalton occasionally struggled with exhaustion from the physical demands of ranch work, becoming short-tempered when he was overtired. But they had learned to talk through their conflicts, to listen to each other's perspectives, to compromise where possible and support each other where it was not. Their love deepened and matured, becoming less about the initial rush of attraction and more about the steady, daily choice to be partners. In the spring of 1880, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complex mix of emotions, joy and excitement tangled with fear and uncertainty. She worried that a baby would end her astronomical work, that she would be too exhausted and too busy to continue her observations. Dalton found her crying in her study one evening, her hand on her still flat belly, a half-written letter to the Naval Observatory on the desk before her. "What is wrong?" he asked, kneeling beside her chair. "I am being foolish," she said, wiping at her tears. "I want this baby, I do. But I am so afraid of losing myself, of becoming just a mother and nothing else." "You could never be just anything," Dalton said firmly. "You are Margaret Drake, amateur astronomer and contributor to human knowledge. You will also be a mother. Both are true. Both can continue to be true." "But how? Babies require constant care, and they sleep, and they grow, and we will figure it out together just like we have figured out everything else." He took her hands. "I promise you, Margaret, we will not let your work stop. Maybe it will slow down for a while, and that is all right. But it will continue. I will make sure of it." She leaned into him, drawing strength from his certainty. "You promise?" "I promise." Their son was born on a cold November night, arriving with a lusty cry that announced his presence to the world. They named him David, after Dalton's father, and he had his mother's blue eyes and his father's dark hair. Margaret fell in love instantly and completely, a different kind of love than she felt for Dalton, but no less intense. The first few months were exhausting in ways Margaret had not anticipated. David was a hungry baby who nursed frequently, and Margaret often felt like a milk source rather than a person. But Dalton kept his promise. He took over many of the household tasks, hired a girl from town to help with laundry and cooking twice a week, and insisted that Margaret continue her observations even if they were less frequent. On clear nights, Dalton would carry David outside in a sling against his chest, and Margaret would work at her telescope while Dalton walked the baby, pointing out constellations and telling their stories. David would stare up at the stars with unfocused infant eyes, and Margaret would glance over from her work to see her husband and son silhouetted against the night sky, feeling a completeness she had not known was possible. As David grew from infant to toddler, he proved to be curious and bright, always asking questions, always wanting to know how things worked. Margaret taught him his letters early, and Dalton taught him about animals and plants and the rhythms of the land. By the time he was 4, David could identify a dozen constellations and knew the names of all the planets. The ranch prospered. Dalton's careful management and genuine skill meant their herd grew steadily. They hired 2 hands to help with the work, young men from town who appreciated Dalton's fair treatment and patient teaching. Margaret's reputation as an amateur astronomer spread, and occasionally, other enthusiasts would write to her or visit, eager to discuss the latest discoveries or theories. She maintained her correspondence with the Naval Observatory and had the profound satisfaction of seeing her name mentioned in a published paper about lunar observations. In 1883, Margaret became pregnant again. This time, she felt less fear and more excitement. She knew now that motherhood and intellectual work could coexist, that she did not have to choose. Their daughter was born in the early summer, a calm baby who seemed to arrive already at peace with the world. They named her Mary, after Margaret's mother, and she had her father's gray eyes and a temperament to match her mother's, thoughtful and observant. Life fell into new patterns with 2 children. The house rang with laughter and occasional tears, with the sounds of David's endless questions and Mary's gurgling baby sounds. Margaret continued her astronomical work, though her focus shifted somewhat. She began writing articles for popular magazines, explaining celestial phenomena in terms that ordinary people could understand, hoping to inspire in others the wonder she felt. Several were published, and the small payments they brought in were gratifying, not for the money itself, but for the validation that her work had value beyond her own satisfaction. Dalton expanded the ranch, buying adjacent land from a neighbor who moved on. They built a larger house, with proper bedrooms for the children and a dedicated observatory for Margaret, a small building with a roof that could slide open to reveal the sky. It was a luxury beyond anything Margaret had imagined in those early days waiting for the telescope that never arrived. The years passed with the kind of busy contentment that makes for a happy life if not always exciting stories. David grew into a serious, studious boy who loved books as much as his mother did and showed a talent for mathematics. Mary proved to have her father's way with animals and spent hours following Dalton around the ranch, learning everything she could. In 1887, Margaret received a letter that made her hands shake as she read it. The Naval Observatory was compiling observations from amateur astronomers across the country to supplement their own work, and they wanted to include her extensive records in their archive. More than that, they were inviting her to submit a paper on her specialized work tracking minor asteroids, which would be published in their proceedings. She ran to find Dalton, who was mending a fence near the barn. "They want to publish my work," she cried, waving the letter. He caught her as she launched herself at him, laughing at her excitement. "Of course they do. Your work is excellent. I am so proud of you." That evening they celebrated with a special dinner. David, now 7, asked intelligent questions about what publication meant and why it mattered. Mary, 4 and already opinionated, declared that her mama was the smartest person in the whole world, and David agreed without reservation. Later, after the children were asleep, Margaret and Dalton climbed the hill behind their house, not to the observatory but to the spot where they had first looked at the stars together all those years ago. They sat on the grass, hand in hand, looking up at the familiar patterns. "Do you remember the first night we came here?" Margaret asked. "I remember thinking you were the most fascinating woman I had ever met and being terrified that I would say something stupid." She laughed. "You were nervous. You seemed so calm and confident." "I was absolutely nervous. I had been thinking about you since I first saw you at dinner, trying to work up the courage to talk to you. Offering to share my telescope seemed like the only way I could think of to spend time with you without making it obvious I was smitten. And here I thought you were just being kind." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder. "I am glad your telescope gave you courage. I am glad you shared it with me. Best decision I ever made." He kissed the top of her head. "Though I think the telescope that never arrived did us a favor. If yours had come, we might never have met, not really. We would have been two strangers passing in the boarding house." I had not thought of it that way. Margaret considered the strange paths that led people to each other. Sometimes disappointments turn into blessings. Often, I think, if we let them. They sat together under the stars, two people who had found each other against odds, who had built a life that honored both their individual dreams and their shared ones. It had not been easy, and it would not always be easy in the years ahead. There would be challenges, losses, hard times. But they would face them together, partners in the truest sense. The years continued to unfold. David went away to university in 1896, a bittersweet day for Margaret, who was proud beyond measure, but also mourning the loss of daily contact with her son. He studied mathematics and astronomy, following in his mother's intellectual footsteps while blazing his own trail. Mary chose to stay on the ranch, working alongside her father and eventually taking over much of the day-to-day management as Dalton's knees began to trouble him. In 1898, when Margaret was 41, they had one more child, an unexpected blessing. James arrived in early spring, a surprise baby who brought new energy to the household. David came home from university to meet his baby brother and joked that James would have the benefit of being raised by the wisest parents since they had practiced on him and Mary first. James grew up in a household rich with learning and love. By the time he was old enough to understand, both his older siblings were established in their own lives. David had become a professor of astronomy at a university back east, publishing papers and teaching the next generation of stargazers. Mary had married a neighboring rancher, a thoughtful young man named Thomas Dalton who appreciated her fierce intelligence and shared her love of the land. Through it all, Margaret and Dalton remained each other's anchor and adventure. They still spent evenings at the telescopes, though now sometimes joined by grandchildren who came to visit. Margaret's published work had grown to include 3 books on amateur astronomy, written in clear, accessible prose that inspired countless people to look up. She had become something of a celebrity in astronomical circles, the self-taught woman from New Mexico who had contributed real science despite all the barriers in her way. Dalton's ranch had become one of the most successful in the region, known for high-quality cattle and fair treatment of workers. But he never lost his love of the stars, and the local newspaper once did a feature on the rancher who could quote Homer and recite the names of distant nebulae while also successfully managing hundreds of head of cattle. In 1910, when Halley's Comet made its once-in-a-lifetime return, Margaret and Dalton sat with all 3 of their children, plus Mary's 2 little ones, and watched the spectacle together. Margaret had been 16 the last time the comet appeared, living a completely different life in a completely different world. Now she was 53, surrounded by the family she and Dalton had built, still looking up with the same wonder she had felt as a girl. "Tell us the story again," Mary's daughter, Sarah, begged, "about how you and Grandpa met." So Margaret told the story once more, about the telescope that never arrived, about the shy cowboy who offered to share his, about the first night they looked at the stars together and began to dream of a shared future. The children had heard it many times, but they never tired of it. It was their origin story, the beginning of the family they belonged to. After the children went to bed, Margaret and Dalton remained outside, watching the comet's tail stretch across the sky like a silver banner. "We have had a good life," Dalton said softly. "We have had a wonderful life," Margaret corrected. "I could not have imagined this when I was young, that I could have everything. The work I love, the family I cherish, a partner who sees me as a complete person. I think we gave each other that gift," Dalton said. "The permission to be whole people, not just playing the roles society expected. Do you ever regret it, marrying someone so unconventional?" "Never. Not for a single moment." He turned to face her, and even after all these years, Margaret felt her heart skip at the love in his eyes. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me. You challenged me to be better, to think deeper, to reach farther, and you gave me this beautiful family and this rich life. How could I regret any of that?" She kissed him, there under the light of Halley's Comet, and felt the same flutter of excitement she had felt the first time, tempered now by decades of trust and partnership. The years grew gentler. Dalton's arthritis worsened, and eventually, Mary and Thomas took over running the ranch entirely, while Dalton advised and enjoyed his grandchildren. Margaret continued her work as long as her eyes allowed, though eventually She had to admit that her vision was not sharp enough for precise observations anymore. But she continued to write, her memory rich with decades of data and experience, and her last book, published when she was 65, became her most popular, a memoir of a life spent looking at the stars and finding meaning both in the heavens and on Earth. They celebrated their 40th wedding anniversary in 1919, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and friends. The party was held on their ranch, and people came from all over, not just family but former ranch hands, fellow astronomy enthusiasts, people whose lives had been touched by Margaret's books or Dalton's generosity. David gave a toast, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. My parents taught me that love is not about limiting each other, but about helping each other become the fullest version of yourselves. They showed me that intelligence and kindness can coexist, that you can work with your hands and dream about the cosmos, that a woman can be brilliant and a man can be gentle, and none of it diminishes either of them. They built something rare and precious, a true partnership, and all of us here are better for having known them. There was not a dry eye in the crowd. Margaret held Dalton's hand as people applauded, and she felt the weight of their years together, the joys and sorrows, the ordinary days and the spectacular ones, all woven into a life well lived. Dalton passed away in the winter of 1922, in his sleep, peacefully. Margaret woke beside him as she had for 43 years and knew immediately that he was gone. She held his hand and wept, mourning the loss of the man who had been her partner, her best friend, her great love. But even in her grief, she felt gratitude for the years they had shared, for the life they had built. At the funeral, Margaret spoke briefly, her voice steady despite her sorrow. Dalton taught me that generosity costs nothing and gains everything. He shared his telescope with a stranger and gained a lifetime companion. He shared his dreams and made room for mine. He shared his love without condition or restriction. The best way to honor him is to do the same, to share what we have, to make room for others' dreams, to love without fear. Margaret lived another 12 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. She spent her days reading, writing letters, telling stories, and on clear nights, she would sit outside and look at the stars, remembering the cowboy who had shown them to her so long ago. She felt his presence in those moments, as if he were sitting beside her still, pointing out constellations and talking about the mysteries of the universe. She passed away in her sleep on a warm June night in 1934, at the age of 77. Her children found her in the morning, lying peacefully in her bed, a slight smile on her face. On her nightstand was the journal she still kept, and the last entry, written the night before, reads simply, "Clear skies tonight, saw Saturn and Jupiter, thought of Dalton and our first night stargazing." Still filled with wonder after all these years, what a gift this life has been. She was buried beside Dalton on their ranch, in a spot on the hill where they had spent so many nights looking at the stars. The headstone was simple, bearing both their names and the dates of their lives, and beneath that a single line, "Together under the stars." David, now a distinguished professor emeritus, spoke at her funeral. "My mother taught me to look up," he said, "to see beyond the immediate, to wonder about the vast universe we are part of. But she also taught me to look around, to see the people beside me, to build connections and relationships that give life meaning. She showed me that you do not have to choose between intellectual pursuits and love, between ambition and family. You can have both if you find the right partner and build a life based on mutual respect and genuine care." Mary spoke next, her voice rough with grief, but strong with conviction. "My parents' love story was not perfect or easy. They worked at it every day, choosing each other again and again. But that is what made it beautiful. It was not a fairy tale. It was real, built on communication and compromise and genuine respect. They gave all of us a model of what partnership could be, and I have tried to live up to that in my own marriage. I hope my children will do the same. James, the surprise baby who was now a grown man with children of his own, spoke last. I was blessed to grow up in a household where both my parents were fully themselves, where my mother could be a scientist and a wife and a mother all at once, where my father could be a rancher and a stargazer and a gentle soul. They taught me that strength comes in many forms, that men can be tender and women can be brilliant, and that love is the force that allows people to become their best selves. I will spend the rest of my life trying to be the kind of man my father was and to honor my mother's legacy by supporting the dreams of those I love. After the funeral, the family gathered at the house. Grandchildren ran through the rooms where their parents and grandparents had grown up. Great-grandchildren, too young to remember Margaret clearly, were told stories about her. And as the sun set, family members began drifting up the hill to the observatory Margaret had used for so many years. David set up his mother's telescope, the one Dalton had shared with her that first night, carefully maintained all these years. One by one, family members took turns looking through it, seeing the same sights Margaret and Dalton had marveled at decades before. Jupiter with its moons, Saturn with its rings, the craters of the moon. As full darkness fell, they all sat on the hill together, 3 generations of the family Margaret and Dalton had started. They looked up at the stars, and Sarah, Mary's daughter who had loved her grandmother's stories, said, "Tell us again about how they met." So they told the story once more, keeping it alive for another generation. The telescope that never arrived, the stargazing cowboy who shared his, the dreams they built together. A love story written in starlight, grounded in respect and care. A reminder that the best relationships make room for both people to shine. The stars wheeled overhead, ancient and unchanging, witnesses to countless human stories. Margaret and Dalton's was just one among millions, but to the family gathered on that hill, it was everything. It was the beginning of their world, the foundation on which they all stood. And somewhere in the vastness of space and time, among the nebulae and galaxies Margaret had studied with such passion, perhaps 2 souls reunited, sharing a telescope once more, looking at new wonders together, their love transcending even death to continue in the infinite cosmos they had spent their lives exploring. The family sat together until late, no one wanting to break the spell of the evening, the sense of connection not just to each other but to Margaret and Dalton, to the past and to the future, to the earth and to the stars. Finally, as midnight approached, they made their way back down the hill, but the observatory remained, its dome open to the sky, ready for the next generation of stargazers, the next dreamers who would look up and wonder. And in the years that followed, the story spread beyond the family. Margaret's books remained in print, inspiring new generations of amateur astronomers. David established a scholarship in his parents' names for women pursuing astronomy, helping to remove some of the barriers his mother had faced. Mary and Thomas ran the ranch with the same values Dalton had exemplified, treating workers fairly and managing the land with care. James became a teacher, passing on his parents' love of learning to hundreds of students. The ranch itself became something of a pilgrimage site for astronomy enthusiasts who knew Margaret's story. The family welcomed visitors on certain nights, allowing them to use the observatory, to look through Margaret's carefully preserved telescopes, to stand where she had stood and see what she had seen. It became a place of inspiration, a reminder that passion and dedication could overcome obstacles, that love could make room for dreams, that two people who respected and supported each other could build something that lasted beyond their own lives. In 1956, when the observatory was formally dedicated as a historical site, David gave a speech, now an elderly man himself, but still passionate about his parents' legacy. "This place represents more than astronomy," he said. "It represents the power of sharing. My father shared his telescope when my mother's never arrived, and in doing so, he shared his life. They taught all of us that the greatest gift we can give is not things but ourselves, our time, our attention, our genuine care for others' dreams. That is the lesson of this place. That is what we want people to remember." The crowd that day included astronomers and ranchers, scientists and cowboys, women who had been inspired by Margaret's example, and men who had learned from Dalton's kindness. It included all three of Margaret and Dalton's children, now elderly themselves, surrounded by their own children and grandchildren. It included people whose lives had been touched in ways large and small by the couple who had looked at the stars together and dared to dream of a life where both could be everything they were meant to be. As the dedication ceremony ended and people mingled, talking and laughing, sharing their own stories of Margaret and Dalton, or of the times they had visited the ranch, a meteor flashed across the darkening sky. Everyone paused to watch it, and someone whispered, "That is Margaret and Dalton, still watching over us." It was fanciful, unscientific, the kind of thing Margaret would have gently corrected in life. But it was also deeply human, the need to see meaning in the cosmos, to believe that love persists beyond death, that the bonds we forge in life echo through eternity. And in that moment, on that hill in New Mexico where two people had fallen in love while looking at the stars, it felt true. The years continued to pass, as they always do. David published a biography of his mother, a thorough and loving account of her life and work that introduced her to a new generation. The ranch continued to operate, now run by Mary's grandchildren, the fourth generation to work the land Dalton had chosen. James's children carried forward the teaching tradition, and one of them, his daughter Catherine, became an astronomer herself, fulfilling a dream that had started with her great-grandmother's telescope that never arrived and the cowboy who had shared his. The story of Margaret and Dalton became part of the fabric of Las Lunas, told and retold, embellished and simplified, but always carrying at its heart the same essential truth. Love is not about possession or control, but about support and partnership. It is about seeing the whole person before you and making room for them to flourish. It is about sharing not just the good times, but also the work, the dreams, the quiet moments under the stars. And for anyone who visited the observatory on the hill, who looked through those carefully preserved telescopes and saw the wonders of the universe spread before them, the message was clear. We are all made of stardust, connected to the cosmos and to each other. The love Margaret and Dalton shared was not unique to them. It was accessible to anyone willing to be generous, to be genuine, to build something based on mutual respect and care. Their story did not end with their deaths. It lived on in their descendants, in the books Margaret wrote, in the ranch Dalton built, in the observatory that still welcomed stargazers, in the scholarship that helped women pursue astronomy, in every person who heard their story and was inspired to be a little braver, a little more generous, a little more willing to share their telescope when someone else's never arrived. It lived on in the stars themselves, constant and beautiful, the same stars they had looked at together on that first night and every night after. The stars that had witnessed their love story and would go on shining long after even their great-great-grandchildren were gone, eternal and unchanging, A reminder that some things, like love and wonder and the human capacity for connection, transcend time and space to become something approaching immortal. And on clear nights, when the conditions were right and the sky was dark enough, you could still find people on that hill, looking up through telescopes, searching for planets and moons and distant galaxies. Some were family members carrying on the tradition. Others were strangers who had heard the story and wanted to see what Margaret had seen. But all of them, in that moment, were connected to something larger than themselves, to the wonder that had brought two people together so many years ago and started a love story that would never truly end.